If portability is important to you when it comes to external storage devices, and the standard 2280 sized enclosures just aren't cutting it, then this could be for you. Complete with active cooling to keep things running at peak performance, the Sharge Disk SSD enclosure. One of the biggest selling points of the Charge Disk is simply its size. It is tiny, all thanks to the compatibility with smaller sized 2230 NVMe SSD drives. While this isn't the only 2230 sized external enclosure on the market, the QuizLab is just a tad larger for instance, what's impressive with the Charge Disk is the built-in active cooling too, which we'll come to in just a moment. The unit itself doesn't take up much room at all. The drive is just 43mm on its longest side and weighs just 21 grams, so size and weight is super small. With a metal construction which is great for passive heat dissipation, one side has an acrylic window that gives you a good look at the SSD that's housed within, while on the other side is arguably the biggest differentiator for this disk, as this is where the fan is located. Of course, its primary job is to ensure the SSD inside doesn't overheat by kicking into action whenever the drive is active. Sharge states a 20-degree differential when the fan is active, which is a bold statement, but even so, there's no doubt that active cooling does make a difference. There are tiny vents on the side that serve as the exhaust too, so air is drawn in and pushed out through these holes, which seems like a good enough solution, although active cooling does mean the fan will be audible when the drive is in use too. Alongside those vents we have a single switch, placing the entire drive into a read-only mode, very handy for making sure your files aren't accidentally overwritten, while at the end, a single USB-C connector that works over the USB 3.2 Gen 2 standard, providing the full 10 gigabits per second bandwidth. What's different here is we get an actual male connector rather than a socket like we would in other SSD enclosures, meaning the drive can plug directly into the host device without the need for any cables, and without the drive being left to dangle around. Particularly useful when used alongside smaller hosts like handheld gaming devices such as the Steam Deck for instance. When it comes to protection though, that comes by means of a separate case that's included in the package and wraps around the main drive. It's still very compact even when it's securely within the case, and this actually gives it some much needed bulk. It can be a little annoying to use in this configuration though. Not only do we add an extra jacket to the drive, so in effect is acting as some insulation rather than letting the heat dissipate, every time the drive is used the side window needs to remain open so that the fan can do its job sucking cool air in and exhausting it through the holes on the side. Otherwise the entire cooling system is blocked and ineffective, and that's the last thing you want when it comes to cooling an SSD. The other annoyance is the USB-C connector is now nestled into the silicon sleeve, meaning the drive can no longer be used bare and must be used with the small extension cable that comes within the package. This is designed to hook onto the available corner of the case for safekeeping, and now also providing a lanyard style design, with the connectors rather securely locked into place while on the move, yet easy enough to release when needed. Note that this is not a standard USB-C cable either, it's a female to male extension cable, with the female end connecting to the drive and now providing us with the standard USB-C male connector to use on the host device. While not in use though, everything packs away nicely enough, with a rubber flap protecting the USB end, providing a good level of shock protection for the drive, and it's also IP54 rated too, protecting from the odd splash of water, which I still wouldn't trust with the side door to be fair, but more importantly, it protects it from dust too. I guess it comes down to your intended usage scenario though, but I've personally found the drive much nicer to use bare, rather than messing about with case windows and extension cables. So, as much as I'm not a big fan of the case, I guess you can only do so much with an active cooling solution to cater for after all. The drive itself carries a really nice design, and better still, we have a completely tool-free installation too, which works by simply sliding the clear window to one side, providing access to the internals. That's literally it. Nice and easy. Here we find the main internal circuitry alongside the NVMe M2 connector, where we can slide in a 2230 drive straight in, taking care to install the provided thermal pad between the board and the SSD mind before connecting, and locking the SSD down into position, up to 2 TB in capacity being supported and held in place with a small rubber grommet. And that's literally it. Drive installation is complete. While this is all easy enough, I can't help feel whether this is all a little back to front though. In essence, the thermal pad is helping move heat from the SSD, but it's transferring that heat to the actual board and its chipset, where the active cooling is then trying to cool the board instead of the SSD. I feel like it's a little counterintuitive. If the fan was placed at the top, it would cool the actual chips on the SSD itself, without needlessly transferring heat to the chipset board in the process. Nevertheless, we'll see how this works in practice shortly, but for now, with everything in place, slide the top cover back on, which is held in place with a magnet, a nice little touch, and we're pretty much set to go. A really nice and simple installation procedure. Using the drive is just as easy. Because of the USB-C connectivity, you can use the Charge Disk with just about any device, be it a computer, tablet, even a smartphone. Using without the supplied case, simply connect to your host device. I do like to ensure the fan is pointing upwards when using with a laptop though, so there's plenty of access to cool air. Of course, it's not so important when using with a portable handheld or any other such device. Either way, a disk speed test shows some respectable speeds. This falls in line with many of the competition, with the bottleneck here being the actual interface itself, although this is pretty much at the top end of what we can expect from a USB 3.2 Gen 2, so I'm quite happy with the results. Equally as impressive are file transfers, which are also quick. Again, nothing to be concerned about here. What's more important is sustaining that speed over longer periods of use when the SSD inside really heats up. Thankfully, that active cooling fan does seem to be doing its job there too. Even while using the drive for longer periods of time, it continued to sustain its performance with no noticeable drops and no throttling. Just be aware that if using the silicone cover, the side window is kept open at all times for the active cooling to do its job. Otherwise, the drive will eventually overheat considering there's no other heatsink or cooling at all. Of course, with any moving parts, especially fans, noise can be an issue. And yes, there is some noise here due to that 11,000 RPM fan, so it's certainly far from being silent. This was clearly noticeable when using with my completely silent MacBook, although it does switch off after a while when the drive isn't being accessed. But when used alongside a handheld, where you have separate audio playing most of the time, it's not so noticeable, if at all. Not a deal breaker, but a point to bear in mind and something you'd have to expect from any actively cooled device. Overall then, the Charge Disk has been great in daily use. It works reliably across a wide variety of devices thanks to its standard USB-C interface, and the Sabrent 2230 drive inside was just as fast as a full-length 2280 drive, with the bottleneck being the USB 3.2 Gen 2 interface itself. While I do find the silicone case a little annoying to use since it needs the window constantly open as well as the extension cable, making it less convenient to use than the naked drive alone, it does offer some protection for the device during transportation, as well as from dust and the odd light splash, and fortunately getting the drive in and out is a relatively painless procedure. It's important to weigh those positives against some notable drawbacks though. The noise level during operation being the main one here. A consequence of its cooling mechanism may be a deciding factor for users who prefer to work in quieter settings. Its compatibility exclusively with 2230 sized SSDs is also a limiting factor, restricting its use to those who have or are willing to invest in this specific SSD type, although saying that, it's what makes the entire drive so compact in the first instance. So if you're looking for an enclosure that lets you slot in this super small SSD form factor, as long as you can see past that annoying case and some slight noise, the Charge Disk is an easy recommendation.